My name is Faye Dawn. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate operations, the kind of role that keeps companies running but rarely gets applause. I live in a city where people move fast, talk faster, and measure worth by volume. I've never been loud. People often mistake that for something else. They see a woman who listens more than she speaks, someone who doesn't interrupt, someone who doesn't rush to correct others in meetings. I've been called steady, nice, and low maintenance. The unspoken translation: harmless, manageable, safe to overlook. What they didn't see, what they never really tried to see, was that silence can mean many things. It can mean fear, it can mean patience, or it can mean that someone is observing everything. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic speeches or explosive showdowns in conference rooms. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no viral moment. It's about something quieter than that. A coworker of mine secretly recorded me, edited the footage, tried to use it to get me fired. And for a brief moment, it almost worked. But there was one detail he didn't think mattered, one piece he forgot to include. And when the full, unedited version surfaced, it changed the entire story. Not just for management, not just for him, for me. This is the story of how being underestimated can feel like erosion. Slow, subtle, almost polite. How disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in smiles. And how the most powerful shift in my life didn't begin with confrontation. It began with a decision to stop reacting and start seeing clearly. If you're expecting dramatic revenge, this isn't that. What happened was quieter, cleaner, irreversible. By the end of this story, someone lost their credibility, someone lost their position, and someone walked away with something far more important than validation. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, honestly, calmly, without exaggeration, because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply plays the full recording. Have you ever realized that the version of you people think they know isn't the full version at all? At the firm, I was the woman who kept things organized. That's what they said, not the strategist behind quarterly workflow redesign, not the one who prevented 2 compliance penalties by catching reporting errors before they reached the board. Just organized, reliable. I was the one people copied on emails when something went wrong, the one who stayed late to clean up the deck, the one asked to just double-check numbers that someone else had presented confidently 5 minutes earlier. And I did it, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. In meetings, I took notes in my black leather notebook while others talked over each other. When I did speak, I chose my words carefully. Concise, structured, unemotional. Sometimes someone would repeat what I'd said 5 minutes earlier, louder, and suddenly it became the solution. I would nod, not out of submission, out of calculation. I learned early that correcting people publicly created friction, so I stopped correcting. I started documenting. To them, I was steady background support. To myself, I was observing patterns. There was a particular rhythm to how I was treated. When deadlines approached, my name surfaced. When recognition was handed out, it dissolved. When mistakes needed absorbing, I was a team player. When success was celebrated, I was part of the support. It wasn't dramatic enough to call out. That's the tricky part about subtle dismissal. It never feels large enough to justify confrontation. Each moment taken alone looks small, forgettable, but stacked together, they form a quiet architecture. There were jokes about how I was too calm, comments that I never get rattled. Once during a performance review, my manager smiled and said, "You're not really leadership material, Faye. You're more of a stabilizer." He meant it as a compliment. I wrote it down. What they didn't know was that my calm wasn't passivity. It was containment. I came from a family where raised voices meant instability, where emotion could shift a room into danger in seconds. I learned young that the person who stayed composed held the real power. So I stayed composed, but invisibility has a cost. When you're consistently positioned as the dependable background presence, people start assuming you'll absorb more than your share. More responsibility, more oversight, more blame. And eventually someone begins to wonder how far that can be pushed. That someone was Daniel. He joined our department 2 years after I did. Charismatic, sharp, comfortable speaking and half-finished thoughts because he trusted others to complete them. People liked him immediately. He had that polished confidence that makes executives lean in. He also had something else, impatience for people he believed were beneath him. I didn't notice it at first. Or maybe I did, but I categorized it as ambition. The first time he interrupted me in a meeting, I let it slide. The second time, I shortened my sentence. By the third, I had already started adjusting my timing. He saw my silence and labeled it weakness. That was his first mistake. At that point, I was still playing the role they'd assigned me, the quiet stabilizer, the operational backbone, the woman who wouldn't make noise. They thought they knew exactly who I was, and in a way they did, just not all of me. The first real cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a joke. We were in a cross-department strategy meeting, 12 people around a long glass table, slides projected on the wall, coffee cooling in paper cups. Daniel was presenting early findings from a workflow audit I had largely structured behind the scenes. I'd built the reporting model. He delivered the summary. That arrangement wasn't unusual. Halfway through the presentation, he clicked to a slide with projections I had flagged the night before as incomplete. "Are we sure about these figures?" I asked calmly. Not confrontational, just precise. He didn't look at me. He smiled at the room instead. "Faye's our resident worrier," he said lightly. "She triple-checks everything. It's cute." A few people chuckled. Not maliciously, reflexively. The word sat there. Cute. I didn't react. I didn't correct him. I didn't point out that the projections were missing two compliance variables that could materially affect the forecast. I simply said, "I'll circulate the updated version after the meeting." He nodded as if indulging me. "See? That's why we keep her around." Keep her around. It was subtle, playful, dismissible. But it was the first time I felt something shift in the room. Not in volume, but in positioning. I was no longer the quiet equal who happened to speak less. I was the cautious side note, the supporting character in his narrative. After the meeting, one of the project leads patted my arm and said, "You're such a good sport." A good sport? That afternoon, I updated the model, sent the corrected projections to the entire leadership team, and attached a brief explanation outlining the missing variables. I kept the tone neutral. No subtext, no accusation. Daniel replied 15 minutes later. "Thanks, Faye. Exactly what I meant in the meeting." Exactly what I meant. He repositioned my correction as his foresight, cleanly, publicly, without raising his voice. That was the moment I understood something important. Disrespect doesn't always arrive with hostility. Sometimes it arrives disguised as charm. I could have called it out. I could have responded in the thread, clarifying that the variables hadn't been mentioned in the meeting. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, because I was watching. Patterns matter more than moments. One isolated incident can be defended. A pattern cannot. Over the next few weeks, the language continued. Our detail-oriented Faye, she'll tidy it up. Don't worry, she loves this stuff. Each comment is small enough to laugh off. Each one reshaped how others perceived my role. And what unsettled me most wasn't that Daniel underestimated me. It was how easily the room adjusted to his framing. No one objected. No one corrected him. Why would they? The story was convenient. He was the visionary presenter. I was the meticulous back-end support. It made meetings smoother, except it wasn't accurate. And inaccuracies, when repeated confidently enough, begin to calcify into truth. One afternoon, I replayed the original meeting recording, a habit I'd developed for documentation. I listened to the moment he called me cute. I watched the body language around the table. I observed who laughed and who looked down. Then I closed my laptop. That was the first small cut, not the joke itself. The realization that he was comfortable reshaping my professional identity in real time, and that he assumed I wouldn't resist. He mistook composure for compliance, and I made a quiet decision that day. If he wanted to build a narrative, I would let him. For now. The second time it happened, no one laughed. That's how I knew it was settling in. We were reviewing a client escalation, a sensitive one involving missed deliverables and potential contractual penalties. I had already drafted a remediation timeline and flagged the legal exposure in writing. Daniel, again, was leading the discussion. When I began outlining the compliance risk, he cut in mid-sentence. "Let's not spiral," he said gently, like he was steadying me. Faye tends to zoom in on worst-case scenarios. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't speculated. I was quoting clauses from the contract. But he'd reframed caution as anxiety, precision as overreaction. The room didn't laugh this time. They just nodded. That was worse, because laughter signals awareness. Nodding signals agreement. I finished my point, shorter now, stripped of emphasis, and let the conversation move on. My notebook remained open on the table. I wrote the date, the phrasing, the response. I told myself it wasn't personal, that this was just how certain personalities operate. Charismatic leaders streamline conversations by simplifying contributors. That was the story I offered myself. And in fairness, there was truth in it. Daniel wasn't cartoonishly malicious. He wasn't yelling or insulting me directly. He wasn't overtly undermining my work. He was editing me, editing tone, editing impact, editing how others interpreted my input. Over time, I noticed subtle shifts. When I raised a concern, someone else would glance at Daniel before responding, as if calibrating whether my comment required serious attention. When I asked clarifying questions, they were sometimes answered by him. It was almost imperceptible. Almost. I began shortening my contributions, tightening them to bullet points, delivering facts without commentary. If I couldn't be reframed as emotional, I could at least be undeniable. But something else was happening inside me. I was rationalizing my silence. It's not worth making this bigger. Pick your battles. Results matter more than recognition. Those phrases became internal scripts. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was measuring it. There's a difference. Conflict without leverage is noise. Conflict with leverage is change. And I didn't have leverage yet. Not the kind that would hold under scrutiny. What I had were impressions, patterns, feelings. Those don't survive executive review. So I did what I've always done best, I observed. I paid attention to when Daniel interrupted others. Rarely. I noted how often he credited senior leadership. Frequently. I watched which phrases he used when speaking about me versus others. Detail-oriented, thorough, cautious. Never strategic, never decisive. Language builds hierarchy. By the end of that quarter, I realized something unsettling. The role was solidifying. The quiet stabilizer, the operational safety net, the woman who would clean up loose ends but never define direction. And part of me wondered if maybe that was all I would ever be there. That was the most dangerous thought of all. Because when you begin accepting a diminished version of yourself as reality, you start shrinking without noticing. You stop volunteering ideas. You let others summarize your contributions. You become easier to overlook because you're already halfway invisible. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel in the hallway speaking to a director from another department. "Faye's great," he said. "Not leadership material, but indispensable support." Not leadership material, the exact phrasing my manager had used in my review months earlier. That's when I understood it wasn't accidental language. It was alignment. A narrative spreading quietly through repetition. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then walked back to my desk. I opened my notebook, and for the first time, I wrote something different. Not what was said, but what did it mean? Every workplace has unofficial roles. There's the visionary, the fixer, the diplomat, the skeptic. And then there's the stabilizer. The stabilizer is dependable, calm under pressure, low drama, always available. The stabilizer absorbs overflow, smooths tension, keeps the machine running when louder personalities collide. It's a respected role, in theory. In practice, it's invisible. By the time Daniel had been at the firm for a year, my role had been fully defined for me. Not through a formal title change. Not through policy. Through repetition. Through tone. Through subtle framing in rooms where I was present but not centered. If a deadline slipped, I was looped in to help tighten things. If a presentation lacked structure, I was asked to refine the flow. If a client seemed uneasy, I was invited to provide reassurance. But when strategic direction was discussed before meetings, in smaller side conversations, in quick huddles outside glass conference rooms, I wasn't included. I wasn't excluded maliciously. I was simply not considered. Because stabilizers don't steer. They're steady. There was one meeting that clarified everything for me. It was a quarterly planning session with senior leadership. I had prepared a comprehensive risk assessment model that projected operational strain under 3 growth scenarios. It wasn't just numbers, it was strategic forecasting. Daniel presented the growth roadmap. Confident, expansive, optimistic. When it was my turn, I walked through the strain points. Hiring lag, compliance exposure, vendor bottlenecks. I wasn't contradicting him, I was completing the picture. When I finished, the COO leaned back in his chair and smiled. "This is why you two work so well together," he said. "Daniel dreams, Faye keeps us grounded." The room murmured approval. It sounded complimentary, balanced, harmonious. But in that framing, direction belonged to him. Restraint belonged to me. Dreamer and limiter. Ambition and caution. It took me years to understand how often women are positioned as the weight tied to a balloon, necessary, but never allowed to float. After that meeting, Daniel stopped by my desk. "See?" he said casually. "Great dynamic. You keep me from going off the rails." I looked at him for a moment longer than usual. He truly believed that was praise. That's what made it so precise. The role assigned to me wasn't incompetent. It was containment. Useful, predictable, non-threatening. And here's the uncomfortable truth: I had participated in it. Not consciously, but through accommodation, through choosing harmony over correction, through letting statements pass when they subtly diminish the scope. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being seen only in fragments. When your reliability is acknowledged, but your leadership is dismissed. When your composure is praised, but your ambition is ignored. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was assessing. Because roles, once assigned, are hard to shed publicly. If I suddenly asserted authority or corrected narratives aggressively, I would look out of character. Emotional, defensive. The stabilizer isn't supposed to destabilize. And Daniel knew that. What he didn't know was that I had stopped internalizing the role. I was still playing it externally, but internally something was shifting. The difference between who they believed I was and who I actually was widening. And gaps like that don't stay quiet forever. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during one of Daniel's polished interruptions or in a hallway conversation overheard by accident. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon alone at my desk. I was reviewing a recording from a client call, something I did routinely when drafting summaries. About 20 minutes in, I heard it. A pause, papers shifting, a faint clicking sound that didn't match the conference line system we used. I replayed it. Then again, it was subtle but distinct. The kind of sound a phone makes when someone activates a recording app. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was ambient noise. Maybe someone had adjusted their headset. I didn't jump to conclusions. That's not how I operate. But I made a note. 2 days later, during an internal strategy session, Daniel positioned his phone face down near the edge of the table, screen briefly flashing before dimming. I noticed because I notice everything now. I didn't say anything, but something in my body recognized a pattern before my mind caught up. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even a suspicion yet. It was awareness. That evening, I stayed late under the quiet hum of overhead lights. I opened the internal server logs, something only a handful of us in operations had access to. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing. I was searching for clarity. And that's when I saw it. A file had been uploaded to a shared executive folder earlier that week. The naming convention was vague: client risk discussion. The timestamp matched the day of the meeting where I had outlined compliance exposure, and Daniel had interrupted me twice. The file wasn't sent to me directly. It wasn't referenced in any email thread I was copied on. But it existed. I opened it. It was an audio clip, short, edited. It began with my voice mid-sentence, and this approach could potentially trigger a breach notice if the timeline isn't. And then it cut. The rest of my analysis was gone. The context, the mitigation strategy, the solution I proposed immediately afterward. The clip made me sound alarmist, abrupt, almost obstructive. And below the file in the thread, Daniel had written, "Concern raised by operations might indicate resistance to accelerated rollout." Resistance, not risk management, not compliance safeguarding. Resistance. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. That surprised me, because in that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't casual framing anymore. This was documentation. He hadn't just been shaping narrative in meetings. He had been recording, editing, curating selective evidence to position me as the cautious obstacle to his forward momentum. And he assumed I would never know. That was the day something shifted. Not anger, clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. I stopped wondering if I was being too sensitive to language. The pattern had moved from subtle repositioning to strategic manipulation. And manipulation, unlike perception, leaves fingerprints. I closed the file. I didn't confront him. I didn't forward it to HR. I didn't schedule a defensive meeting. Instead, I opened a new document. Title, timeline. I listed dates, meetings, language used, files uploaded, thread participants, no commentary, no emotion, just sequence. If he were building a narrative, I would build the full archive. Not to retaliate, to complete the story. Because the most dangerous position isn't being underestimated. It's being misrepresented. And once someone decides to rewrite you, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a choice. That night, I slipped my black leather notebook into my bag and turned off the lights in the office. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't playing the stabilizer. I was preparing. After I found the edited recording, I didn't sleep less. I slept better. Clarity has that effect. It replaces confusion with direction. For months, I had been operating in a fog of subtlety, unsure whether the dismissals were intentional, whether the framing was strategic, whether I was misreading tone. Now I knew, and knowledge, even uncomfortable knowledge, is stabilizing. The next morning, I walked into the office exactly as I always had. Same measured steps, same charcoal blazer. The same notebook was placed neatly on the conference table. Daniel greeted me with his usual easy smile. "Morning, Faye." "Morning," I replied, calm, neutral. Nothing in my expression suggested that I had listened to the file he uploaded, that I had read the thread carefully, that I had already archived a copy in 3 separate time-stamped locations. Silence at that point stopped being the default. It became deliberate. Over the next few weeks, I adjusted nothing externally and everything internally. I continued contributing in meetings, but I became even more precise. When discussing risk, I framed it in structured tiers. Here is the exposure. Here is the mitigation. Here is the cost of ignoring it. I removed any possible angle for emotional reinterpretation. More importantly, I began requesting written confirmations. Just to align, Danielle, you're comfortable proceeding with option A despite compliance flag B? Always polite, always documented. He never hesitated. He was confident. He believed his momentum insulated him, and I let him believe that. I also began paying closer attention to logistics. Which meetings were recorded automatically? Which ones weren't? Who had admin rights to upload files? How access permissions were granted? It wasn't paranoia. It was mapping terrain. People mistake preparation for suspicion. Preparation is neutral. There was one meeting in particular that crystallized the shift. We were discussing an accelerated rollout timeline again, the same initiative he had framed me as resistant to. I laid out a concise risk summary and ended with, "If leadership chooses to proceed, I'll document mitigation protocols accordingly." Notice the phrasing, not "if we proceed." If leadership chooses to proceed. It subtly reallocated ownership. Daniel nodded. "That's why we have you," he said lightly. I smiled back. "Exactly." He heard agreement. I meant acknowledgement. The more composed I became, the more comfortable he seemed pushing narrative edges. I noticed him glancing at his phone more often during discussions. Once I caught the faint reflection of the recording icon on his darkened screen. Still, I didn't confront him, because confrontation without full evidence would reduce this to a personality dispute. And personality disputes are subjective. Documentation isn't. What he didn't understand was that silence can operate on 2 frequencies. The first is avoidance. The second is containment. I was no longer containing emotion. I was containing timing. There's a strategic advantage in letting someone believe they are unobserved. People reveal more when they feel safe, when they think the narrative is secure. And Daniel felt secure. He had executive visibility. He had growth metrics attached to his name. He had begun subtly positioning himself as the future of the department. In that positioning, I was a footnote. But footnotes, when read in full context, often change the meaning of the entire page. By the end of that month, I had something I hadn't possessed before. Alignment between instinct and proof. Silence wasn't weakness. It was leveraging accumulated interest. And he still thought I was simply being steady. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. I still arrived at 8:15 every morning. I still refilled the office printer when it jammed. I still sent calendar reminders and corrected slide formatting 5 minutes before presentations. Nothing about me appeared different. That was intentional, because what I was doing behind the scenes didn't require performance. It required patience. The first thing I built was a mirrored archive. Every meeting I attended that involved strategic decisions or compliance discussions, I downloaded the official recording within policy limits. Our system automatically stores them for 30 days unless flagged for retention. Most people never flag them. I did. Not selectively, systematically. If Daniel were curating excerpts, I would maintain the originals. The second thing I did was subtler. I began summarizing meetings in structured follow-up emails, concise, neutral, bullet-pointed. Per today's discussion, risk tier identified as moderate to high under scenario B, mitigation strategy proposed, phased rollout with legal review, decision deferred pending executive confirmation, no commentary, no emotion, just clarity. These emails weren't defensive, they were alignment tools. They also created a time-stamped context that couldn't be easily reframed later. What no one noticed was that Daniel gradually stopped replying to those summaries. Instead, he responded directly to executives in separate threads. I noticed that pattern mattered. I also started building relationships outside our immediate department. Not socially, structurally, I scheduled brief check ins with compliance, legal, and IT security under the premise of improving cross functional reporting. All legitimate, all within my role. During one of those conversations, an IT security manager casually mentioned that unauthorized recording in certain states could violate internal policy depending on disclosure. I didn't react. I didn't ask follow-up questions that would sound pointed. I simply made a note. State laws vary on consent for recording conversations. Washington, where I lived and worked, requires two-party consent, meaning both parties must be aware of and agree to being recorded in private conversations. I confirmed this quietly through policy documentation available on our intranet. Again, no accusation, just verification. Weeks passed. Daniel continued uploading selective clips to executive folders, always brief, always lacking full context. Each one subtly frames me as cautious friction against his momentum. But here's what he never noticed. He was only uploading moments where I raised risk. He never uploaded the segments where I offered solutions. He never included the portions where executives agreed with my mitigation strategies. He curated tension without resolution, and that curation revealed intent. Intent is everything. If he had shared full recordings, even with critical framing, it could have been interpreted as transparency. But selective editing signals narrative construction. One afternoon, I conducted a quiet experiment. During a meeting, I intentionally paused mid-sentence after outlining a compliance risk. I waited. Daniel predictably interjected with, "We don't want to overcomplicate this." Then I continued calmly, which is why the mitigation plan I circulated addresses it within the current timeline. I watched his expression flicker, just briefly. That meeting was recorded automatically by the system, not by his phone. 2 days later, he uploaded a clip to executives. It ended exactly at his interruption. My continuation, the mitigation plan, was absent. That was the confirmation I needed, not suspicion. Pattern, I added the timestamp comparison to my timeline document. Official recording length, 54 minutes. Uploaded clip length, 37 seconds. When you line up enough of those comparisons, a shape forms. I wasn't building a case out of resentment. I was assembling an objective record of editorial behavior. Meanwhile, externally, I remained composed, helpful, measured. He mistook that composure for obliviousness. But here's something most people underestimate. Quiet people often have the highest tolerance for delayed gratification. We don't require immediate correction to feel secure. We're comfortable waiting for the right inflection point. By the end of the quarter, I had archived original recordings, preserved executive threads, logged timestamps of edited uploads, documented state consent laws, established relationships with compliance and IT, and still I hadn't acted, because leverage is most powerful before it's revealed. Daniel thought he was shaping perception upward. What he never noticed was that every selective edit was building the contrast I would eventually need. The full unedited version was always there, waiting. The reveal didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in my apartment on a quiet Sunday evening with my laptop open and the city humming faintly beyond the windows. I had reached a point where observation was no longer enough. I needed to see everything laid out, not emotionally, but structurally. So I built a side-by-side comparison. On the left, Daniel's uploaded clips. On the right, the full official recordings from the internal system. I aligned them by timestamp. What I saw wasn't dramatic, it was meticulous. In clip after clip, the pattern repeated. My voice raises a compliance concern. A pause, his interruption. The clip ends. Gone were the portions where I proposed solutions. Gone were the executive responses acknowledging the necessity of my points. Gone were the follow-up decisions that adopted my mitigation strategies. He hadn't fabricated anything. He had curated it. And curation is harder to defend than fabrication, because it requires intent. One particular meeting stood out. It was the same client escalation discussion from weeks earlier. In the uploaded clip, my sentence ended with, "This could potentially trigger a breach notice." Full stop. In the actual recording, what followed immediately was, which is why I recommend we pre-notify legal and adjust milestone sequencing. That keeps us compliant and protects the client relationship. The executive response? Good catch, let's implement that. That entire exchange The solution, the approval, the implementation had been erased from his version. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, not out of anger, out of clarity, because now I understood the shape of the story he was telling upstairs. Faye resists. Faye slows progress. Faye focuses on problems. Not Faye identifies risk and solves it. The part he forgot to include changed the entire story. And I had every version of it. There was another layer, too. While reviewing metadata on one of the clips, I noticed something subtle. The file creation timestamp on his upload didn't match the meeting date. It had been processed through editing software before being shared internally. That detail mattered. It meant the clip wasn't casually trimmed on a phone. It had been intentionally edited, deliberately constructed. I double-checked internal policy regarding recording conversations without disclosure. Washington is a two-party consent state. Private workplace conversations, especially those not formally designated as recorded, cannot legally be recorded without consent from all parties. Our official system announcements clearly stated when meetings were being recorded. Daniel's phone did not. I confirmed something else. Uploading externally recorded content into company systems without disclosure violated IT governance policy. Again, I didn't celebrate this discovery. I sat very still, because leverage isn't exciting when you first hold it. It's sobering. At that moment, I had multiple options. I could go directly to HR with the consent law issue. I could escalate to IT security with evidence of unauthorized recording and edited uploads. I could confront Daniel privately and demand an explanation, but each path had different consequences. I asked myself a question I hadn't needed to ask before. What outcome do I actually want? Not revenge, not humiliation, not even vindication. I wanted my professional identity restored. Accurately, not dramatically. I wanted the narrative corrected in the same rooms where it had been shaped. And I wanted it done in a way that couldn't be dismissed as emotional retaliation. So I kept everything private. No one knew I had discovered the edits. No one suspected I had full recordings archived beyond the automatic retention window. Externally, I remained the stabilizer. Internally, I now held something far more significant than frustration. I held contrast, a curated version of me, and the full unedited truth. The power wasn't in exposing him immediately. It was in choosing the moment when exposure would be irreversible. That moment was approaching. There's a quiet kind of pressure that builds when you're holding information no one else knows you have. It isn't urgent. It's gravity. By the time I finished reviewing every edited clip against its full recording, I had something undeniable. A documented pattern of selective editing, unauthorized recording, and narrative framing that misrepresented my professional conduct. But information alone isn't action. Action requires decision. And the decision wasn't simple. I listed my options again, this time not as possibilities, but as consequences. If I went to HR immediately, the issue would likely be contained within policy violation language. It would become about recording consent, about IT governance, about the process. That might address his behavior, but it wouldn't correct the narrative already seeded among executives. If I confronted Daniel privately, he would deny intent, reframe it as a misunderstanding, possibly even accuse me of being defensive. Without the room present, it would become his word against mine, despite the evidence. And if I escalated directly to executive leadership without structure, I risked appearing reactive, emotional. Strategic timing matters. So I asked myself a harder question. What moment would make the truth self-evident? The answer came unexpectedly. 2 weeks later, our firm scheduled a high-stakes executive review meeting for the Accelerated Rollout Initiative, the very project Daniel had been championing. The agenda included performance risks and departmental alignment, senior leadership, the COO, legal counsel, all present. Daniel was slated to present progress and address operational resistance concerns. Operational resistance. That phrase wasn't accidental. It had appeared in multiple threads, subtle, repeated, unchallenged. It was becoming institutional language. I realized something then. If he chose to present another curated clip in that meeting, another selective excerpt implying I was obstructive, and I remained silent, the narrative would solidify permanently. But if I interrupted prematurely, I would look reactive. The irreversible option was different. It required patience. I emailed the meeting organizer, neutrally, professionally, requesting that the official system recording be enabled due to cross-functional implications. That request was routine, sensible. No one questioned it. Then I prepared something else, a simple folder on my laptop. Inside, the full official recordings, The edited clips Daniel had uploaded, timestamp comparisons, policy excerpts regarding two-party consent, IT governance language, about unauthorized recordings, a concise, factual timeline document. No accusations, no adjectives, just sequence. I rehearsed nothing. Because this wasn't a speech, it was a correction. The night before the meeting, Daniel sent a late email previewing his slides. One slide title caught my attention: Addressing Operational Hesitation. Hesitation, not risk management, not compliance oversight. Hesitation. I closed the email and felt something unexpected. Not anger, relief. Because now the moment wasn't hypothetical, it was inevitable. If he played another edited clip, I would wait. I would let it finish. And then I would ask one calm question. Could we review the full recording for context? That's all it would take. No accusations, no raised voices, no public shaming. Just the full unedited version. The part he forgot to include. I wasn't choosing confrontation. I was choosing exposure through completeness. And once completeness enters a room built on fragments, the structure shifts. Some decisions can be reversed. This one couldn't. Because once executives hear the full version, once they see intentional omission, credibility doesn't fracture slowly. It collapses. Quietly. The morning of the executive review felt almost ordinary. That's the strange thing about pivotal days. They rarely announce themselves. The sky over Seattle was gray, the elevators moved too slowly, and someone had left burnt coffee sitting in the break room. Externally, nothing had shifted. Internally, everything had aligned. I arrived early, not to rehearse, to observe. I wanted to see how Daniel carried himself before the meeting, whether there was hesitation, whether he sensed anything. There wasn't. He moved with the same polished confidence he always did. Laptop tucked under one arm, easy smile, quick nods to senior leadership in the hallway. If he felt tension, he hid it well. Or maybe he truly believed his narrative was airtight. The conference room filled gradually. COO at the head, legal counsel to his right, two executive directors dialing in remotely. The official system recording indicator glowed red in the corner of the screen. Documented, transparent, Daniel began his presentation smoothly. Growth metrics, timeline compression, positive client sentiment. He paced himself well, controlled, articulate. Then he clicked to the slide I had seen the night before. Addressing operational hesitation. The word sat there in bold font. He framed it gently, almost sympathetically. We've had some internal concerns raised regarding risk exposure, he said. I want to make sure leadership has full visibility. Full visibility. Then he played it. A short clip, my voice. This approach could potentially trigger a breach notice. The audio ended there, silence in the room. Not hostile, but attentive. He continued, while diligence is important, we also have to balance speed and innovation. There it was again, the curated version of me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I let him finish the slide. I let the COO ask a clarifying question. I let Daniel answer it confidently. And then when the natural pause came, I spoke. My tone was steady, almost curious. Could we review the full recording for context? The room shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. Daniel blinked once. This is the relevant portion, he replied lightly. I believe the mitigation strategy immediately followed. I said, it might be helpful for alignment. I wasn't challenging him. I was inviting completeness. The COO looked toward the screen. Do we have access to the full meeting file? Yes, I answered. It was recorded through the system. No accusation, just a fact. There was a brief pause while IT pulled up the official archive. Daniel remained composed. But I noticed something subtle. His fingers stopped tapping the table. The full recording began. My voice again. This approach could potentially trigger a breach notice. Then the rest. Which is why I recommend we pre-notify legal and adjust milestone sequencing. That protects the client and keeps rollout on track. Executive voice from the original meeting. Good catch. Let's implement that. The room went still. Not dramatic stillness, analytical stillness. The difference between obstruction and solution had just been made audible. No one looked at me immediately. They were processing, comparing, recalculating. The COO turned to Daniel. Why wasn't that portion included? The question was neutral, not accusatory, but it carried weight. Daniel hesitated. Barely perceptible, but present. I was focusing on the initial concern, he said. Didn't think the rest was necessary. Didn't think it was necessary. I remained silent, because the contrast was already visible, and once contrast enters the room, explanation rarely repairs it. The consequences hadn't begun yet, but they had been set in motion. Quietly, no one raised their voice. That's important to understand. There was no dramatic accusation, no slammed laptops, no public shaming. The shift was quieter than that. After the full recording played, the COO didn't immediately address me. He didn't defend Daniel either. He simply asked IT to pause the playback. Then he said evenly, "Let's continue reviewing in full." We did, and once you hear one omission, you begin listening differently. Every subsequent clip Daniel referenced that morning was requested in its complete version. Not aggressively, just methodically. Each time the pattern repeated: concern, interruption, solution, previously excluded. By the third comparison, the room no longer felt analytical. It felt recalibrated. Legal counsel spoke for the first time. For clarity, she said, "Are these excerpted clips self-recorded or pulled from system archives?" Daniel answered carefully, "I recorded certain discussions for reference." For reference, she repeated. "Were all parties aware?" Silence. Washington is a two-party consent state. Everyone in that room knew it, especially the legal. Daniel's confidence thinned, not shattered, just thinned. "I may not have formally disclosed every instance," he said. May not have. The phrasing didn't help him. Again, I didn't speak, because this was no longer about my tone or my perceived hesitation. It was about process integrity, documentation ethics, leadership trust. And trust, once questioned at the executive level, rarely recovers quickly. The meeting concluded without a verdict. No one announced consequences. No one made grand statements about values, as the COO simply said, "We'll follow up internally," which is executive language for, "This will not be ignored." The days that followed were revealing. Daniel stopped copying broad executive threads and began limiting his distribution lists. His once confident hallway conversations became shorter, controlled. He avoided eye contact with me, not out of hostility but calculation. There was an internal audit initiated quietly by IT security. I wasn't informed directly, but I noticed access logs tightening. Meeting recording disclosures were reiterated company-wide under the guise of policy refresh. No one publicly linked it to him, but everyone felt it. Colleagues who had previously nodded along to his framing began looping me into discussions earlier. "Faye, what's your take?" became a more frequent question. Not dramatically, subtly. The narrative was shifting, not because I demanded it, but because completeness had exposed distortion. One afternoon, a director from another department stopped by my desk. "I reviewed the rollout risk model again," she said. "It was thorough. We should have emphasized that more." Should have. It wasn't an apology, it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement is often more powerful than apology. Daniel wasn't terminated immediately. That's not how organizations operate at this level. Instead, scrutiny increased. His proposals were examined more closely. His independent uploads required verification. Momentum slowed, not because I attacked him, because his credibility had developed a fracture, and once leadership begins questioning intent, advancement pauses. The most telling moment came a week later during another executive call. Daniel hesitated before referencing a previous discussion. Then he said carefully, "As documented in the full recording, he had learned the language. But trust once thinned doesn't thicken overnight. The consequences had begun, not explosive, structural. And structures shift more permanently than emotions ever could. Damage at that level doesn't look like panic. It looks like overcorrection." In the weeks following the executive review, Daniel became meticulous about transparency. Every meeting he scheduled included an explicit recording disclosure. Every follow-up email was longer than necessary, detailed, almost defensive. It wasn't subtle. The man who once curated 37-second excerpts was now attaching full transcripts. But here's what he didn't understand. Behavior adjustments after exposure don't erase intent before it. They highlight it. Executives began asking him clarifying questions he'd never faced before. "Can you provide source context? Who else was present? Was this alignment confirmed?" The tone wasn't hostile. It was cautious. Caution was directed at him, and that was new. One afternoon, I was called into a brief meeting with HR and legal, not as an accused party, as a witness. They asked neutral, structured questions. Had I been aware of recordings? Had consent been requested? Had any of the uploaded clips misrepresented discussion outcomes? I answered calmly, factually. I provided timestamp documentation when requested. No commentary, no emotional framing. At one point, the HR director paused and said, "Why didn't you escalate this earlier?" It was a fair question. "Because I wanted the full context available," I replied. "Without it, it would have been subjective." She nodded slowly. Subjective disputes are difficult to adjudicate. Documented contrasts are not. Daniel, meanwhile, was called into separate reviews. I never asked what was said. I didn't need to. His posture changed. His once fluid confidence became careful precision. He attempted a private conversation with me once. "Faye, I think this has been misunderstood," he began, standing near my desk at the end of the day. I closed my notebook gently. "What part?" He hesitated. That was the first real hesitation I'd ever seen from him. "The editing. It wasn't malicious. I was highlighting concerns." "I noticed," I said evenly. There was no accusation in my tone. That unsettled him more than anger would have. "I didn't realize it would be interpreted that way," he continued. "The full recordings clarified it," I replied. "Clarified. Not exposed, not proved. Clarified." He studied my face, perhaps searching for resentment. He didn't find it. Because there wasn't any. There was only alignment. "I hope this doesn't impact how we work together," he said finally. "It depends on how we work," I answered. That was the closest we came to confrontation. Within a month, leadership announced a restructuring initiative tied to governance reinforcement and cross-functional trust. Daniel's role was adjusted. Not demoted publicly, but repositioned into a more collaborative capacity with reduced unilateral discretion. Translation: oversight. Opportunities that had once seemed within his reach quietly shifted elsewhere. His name appeared less frequently in forward-looking leadership discussions. Not erased, but reconsidered. The irreversible part wasn't the policy violation. It wasn't even the consent issue. It was the recognition of selective intent. Once leadership sees that someone is willing to shape narrative through a mission, every future communication carries a shadow. And shadows in executive spaces limit trajectory. There was no dramatic firing, no public reprimand, just a gradual narrowing of momentum. Too late to fix. Because trust doesn't collapse loudly. It thins until it can't support weight anymore. The final conversation happened on a Thursday evening. Most of the office had emptied. The lights above the open workstations were dimmed to their softer after-hours setting, and the city outside the windows reflected back at us like a second room. Daniel approached my desk again. This time, he didn't stand. He pulled a chair across from me and sat down. There was no performance left in him. "I owe you a direct conversation," he said. His tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic either. It was measured. The way people speak when they realize narrative control has shifted. I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. "I'm listening." He exhaled slowly. When I recorded those meetings, I told myself it was strategic, that leadership needed clarity, that momentum required focus. He paused. "But I can see how it looked." I didn't interrupt. Silence is powerful when it's not hostile. "You were never resisting," he continued. "You were protecting the project." I simplified it. Simplified. That word carried more honesty than anything else he'd said in weeks. "You simplified it in a way that removed context," I replied calmly. "Context changes meaning." He nodded once. I thought highlighting tension would demonstrate decisiveness. "And removing resolution?" Another pause, longer this time. I didn't think it mattered. There it was. Not malice, not hatred, not some dramatic vendetta. Just ambition untethered from fairness. "You thought the part I added didn't matter," I said evenly, "but it was the entire solution." The air between us wasn't heavy, it was clear. "I never intended to jeopardize your reputation," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. "And I meant it, because intention and impact are different things." He hadn't set out to destroy me. He had set out to elevate himself, and in doing so, he treated my credibility as expendable. That's what changed my posture toward him. Not anger, recognition. "What happens now?" he asked. That question told me everything. He was used to defining outcomes. Now he was asking for them. "Now," I said, "we operate with full transparency in every room." He nodded again, slower. "And if I hadn't requested the full recording?" he asked carefully. I held his gaze. Then the narrative would have hardened. We both understood what that meant. He stood after a moment, smoothing the front of his jacket, a gesture I'd seen hundreds of times before presentations. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not turning this into something louder." I considered that. "I didn't need to," I replied. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not charming this time, just human. Then he walked away. That was our confrontation. No raised voices, no accusations, no humiliation. Just acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't repair everything, but ensures it can't be repeated. Something interesting happens when your identity is restored quietly. There's no dramatic applause, no sudden shift in title, no viral recognition moment. But the room feels different. After everything's settled, The audits, the restructuring, the careful recalibrations, my work didn't change. I still built models, I still reviewed contracts, I still asked precise questions in meetings. What changed was how those questions were received. When I spoke, no one looked to Daniel for translation anymore. When I outlined risk, it was treated as strategy, not hesitation. The subtle hierarchy that had once positioned me as the ballast to someone else's balloon dissolved. Not because I demanded it, because the full picture had been heard. Leadership began inviting me into pre-meetings, the small strategy huddles that happened before the larger presentation. "We'd like your input early," the COO said once, almost casually. Early, not as a cleanup, not as a stabilizer, as an architect. But here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. There's a difference between winning and being accurately seen. Winning implies competition. Being seen implies clarity. I wasn't interested in overtaking Daniel. I wasn't interested in proving superiority. I was interested in removing distortion. And once distortion is removed, you don't need to perform strength. It's simply there. Daniel and I continued working together, differently. He became more collaborative, more measured. Occasionally, he would pause mid-sentence and say, "Faye, what are we missing?" That question mattered more than any apology could have. As for me, I stopped shrinking my sentences. I stopped editing myself preemptively to avoid interruption. Not because I was suddenly louder, but because I no longer felt the need to minimize for comfort. The emotional wound I carried, the old instinct to equate silence with safety, softened. I realized something important. Silence is powerful when it's chosen, not when it's required. And I had chosen mine. Looking back, I don't see Daniel as a villain. I see him as someone who underestimated the cost of narrative control, someone who believed ambition justified selective framing. What changed me wasn't exposing him. It was recognizing that I didn't need to shout to correct a story. I just needed the full recording. I'm still calm, still observant, still measured. But I am no longer invisible, not because I became louder, because I became complete. And completeness carries its own authority. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Misrepresentation doesn't always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it arrives as an omission. A trimmed sentence, a missing paragraph, a carefully chosen fragment presented as the whole. And when that happens, the instinct to react immediately can be overwhelming. To correct, to defend, to escalate. But correction without completeness can sound like an argument. Completeness, on the other hand, speaks for itself. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I caught him in a dramatic lie. I didn't win because I exposed him publicly. I simply requested the full, unedited version. The part he forgot to include changed the entire story. And that's the part most people underestimate. When someone shapes a narrative about you, in a workplace, in a relationship, in any space where perception matters, ask yourself, is this the whole recording, or just the part that benefits them? Quiet dominance isn't about silence for the sake of endurance. It's about choosing when to speak so that your words land with weight. It's about understanding that timing can be more powerful than volume. I don't carry resentment toward Daniel. I don't replay the moment in the executive meeting with satisfaction. What I carry is something steadier than that. The knowledge that my credibility doesn't depend on how someone edits me. It depends on the full context of who I am and how I operate. And once leadership heard that full context, nothing else needed to be said. So now I want to ask you, have you ever realized that someone was presenting a version of you that wasn't complete? And if you had access to the full recording of your story, when would you choose to press play?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.